The jungle does not go silent for nothing. Every man who has spent a night inside triple canopy forest, in that particular darkness that has no gradation, no horizon, no reference, knows this the way he knows his own breathing. The jungle speaks constantly. It rustles and drips and clicks and hums and rhythms, so layered they become a kind of white noise. And when that noise stops, even partially, even for 2 or 3 seconds, every nerve in the human body registers it before the conscious mind has time to name it. On this night, it had been silent for 40 minutes. The soldier on watch had not moved. He had not radioed. He sat with his rifle across his knees and his back against a sandbag wall, and he watched the tree line. He had been watching the tree line for 40 minutes. Later, when he tried to describe what he'd been looking at, he struggled. He said it was not movement exactly. It was more like the absence of movement where there should have been movement. Like something out there was holding very, very still. He said it felt like being watched. He said that whatever was watching them, it had been watching them for a long time before any of them noticed. If you find value in documentary storytelling that takes military history seriously, the accounts, the records, the questions that remain unanswered, we would be honored to have your support. Subscribing to this channel helps us continue producing work of this length and depth. It costs nothing and it means a great deal. The Korean Peninsula in the winter of 1950 and into the spring of 1951 was, by almost any measure, one of the most psychologically punishing environments in which American soldiers had ever been asked to operate. The terrain alone was severe. The peninsula is mountainous along most of its length, not gentle rolling hills, but hard granite ridges that rise abruptly from narrow valleys, peaks that can exceed 4,000 feet, slopes that in winter become sheets of ice and in summer become channel for rain, that falls in quantities that cannot be easily imagined by those who have not seen a monsoon. The temperature in winter dropped to 30 and 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit in some sectors. Men lost fingers. They lost toes. Entire companies reported frostbite casualties that exceeded their combat casualties in certain weeks. The tactical situation by the spring of 1951 had stabilized into something that historians have called a war position, grinding, attritional, resembling in certain respects the static front lines of the First World War more than the mobile campaigns of the Second. The initial dramatic movements of the conflict, the Pusan perimeter, the Incheon landing, the advance to the Yalu River, had given way to something more durable and more wearing. Both sides were dug into ridgelines. Both sides were conducting night operations. Both sides were bleeding steadily in engagements that rarely made headlines. The soldiers of the U.S. Army's 25th Infantry Division were deployed in a sector of the Central Front known informally as the Iron Triangle, a region bounded by the towns of Chorwon, Kumwa, and Pyongyang that formed a strategic corridor the North Korean and Chinese forces had used extensively to move troops and supplies southward. Securing the Iron Triangle meant holding the ridgelines around it, which meant digging in on exposed hilltops and maintaining watch through nights that lasted, in winter, more than 14 hours. Night watch rotations were standard, 2 hours on, 4 hours off, cycling through position. The men who were off were expected to sleep in whatever shelter had been constructed, mostly sandbag bunkers dug into the hillside. The men on watch sat or stood at their designated positions along the perimeter, watching the valley below and the ridgelines opposite. This is the routine into which everything that follows was inserted. The official after-action reports for the units operating in this sector during the spring and early summer of 1951 record artillery exchanges, patrol contacts, periodic mortar fire, and the usual logistical and medical notes. They record weather, terrain conditions, unit positions, and casualties. What the official records do not fully account for is what the men on night watch reported seeing, and more specifically, what they reported feeling in those hours before dawn when the Iron Triangle went quiet around them. The stories began circulating, as such stories always do in military environments. Informally, one man would tell another during a meal or during the long wait before patrol. The accounts were passed without fanfare, without drama. They were mentioned the way soldiers mention anything that does not yet have a category, carefully and with a certain tentativeness, as though the speaker is still deciding whether what he experienced deserves to be spoken aloud at all. What was being described, across multiple units and multiple positions, was a persistent and specific sensation, not an attack, not a contact, not anything that could be logged or fired upon. It was a sensation of sustained observation, of being watched from a fixed point at range, with patience that exceeded anything a human threat would require. Men reported noticing it during night watch, almost always in the hours between midnight and 4 in the morning. They described looking at a particular point, a tree line, a ridge line, a cluster of rocks on a slope, and feeling with complete certainty that something at that point was looking back. Several men, in separate accounts collected by researchers decades later, used nearly identical language. They described the sensation as pressure. One veteran recalled it as a feeling of a hand pressed flat against the back of his neck, without contact, without warmth, just presence. Some men said nothing about it at the time. The culture of a combat infantry unit does not encourage the reporting of feelings. Others mention it to the man who relieved them in the whispered exchange that takes place during watch rotation, and discover that the man they were relieving had felt the same thing in the same direction at the same time. Similar observations were appearing not only across different positions within the Iron Triangle sector, but, as would later become apparent through the slow accumulation of veteran testimony collected over subsequent decades, from units that had no contact with one another in sectors separated by significant distances across different periods of the conflict. The pattern that emerged was not one of dramatic encounter. It was subtler than that, and in certain respects more disturbing for its subtlety. It was a pattern of something that watched without acting, that observed without revealing itself, that maintained its vigil night after night in the same direction, at the same approximate hour. What the soldiers described, when pressed for specifics, fell into several consistent categories. The first was directional consistency. Whatever they were sensing, or in some cases seeing, it was always described as coming from the same general bearing relative to the unit's position, not surrounding them, not above them, from one specific direction, sustained. This is notable because the psychological explanations typically offered for this kind of experience tend to produce omnidirectional or shifting sensations of threat. What was being described here was fixed. The second was behavioral consistency. The thing, and the word thing is used deliberately here, because none of the men who reported these experiences could offer a more precise classification, did not approach. It did not retreat. It did not make sound. On the few occasions when men reported actually seeing something, the description was of stillness rather than motion, a shape that did not move in ways that shadows or animals move, a form that held itself with what one veteran, interviewed decades later, described as deliberate composure. The third was temporal consistency. These observations clustered repeatedly in the pre-dawn hours. Military psychiatrists and researchers who have studied combat stress note that this is precisely the period when human alertness is at its lowest, when sleep deprivation compounds most severely, and when the mind is most susceptible to pattern recognition errors. This is a relevant and important fact. It is also true that some of these observations were made by men who had slept, who were fresh on their watch rotation, and who described themselves at the time as alert. There is one detail that does not fit cleanly into the available explanatory frameworks. Several men reported that whatever they sensed on these watches produced a specific physical response. Not fear exactly, they said, but something more like the body preparing for something it could not yet identify. An acceleration of attention, a sharpening that one veteran compared to the moments before an ambush, when the body somehow knows before the mind does. And yet, nothing happened. Whatever was out there, whatever they felt watching them, it never moved. It never engaged. It was simply persistently there. This was not, it should be noted, the the first time American soldiers had described this experience in a wartime environment during the island campaigns of the Pacific War, specifically among the Marine units that fought on Peleliu and later on Okinawa in 1944 and 1945. Similar accounts appear in the oral histories collected by veterans organizations in the decades following the war. The conditions were different in their specifics, but recognizable in their structure. Dense vegetation, extreme heat and humidity, terrain that favored concealment absolutely over visibility, nights that produced near total darkness. What the Marines on Peleliu described, and what appears in several of the oral testimonies archived by the U.S. Marine Corps Historical Division, was an experience on night watch that a number of men characterized as different from the standard fear of ambush. One veteran, in an interview conducted in the 1980s, described lying in a shell crater during a watch rotation on the southern end of the island and becoming suddenly and completely convinced that something was positioned approximately 30 yards to his left in a stand of shattered palms, and that it was neither moving nor making any sound. He said he held that position for what he estimated as 20 minutes. He said he never fired. He said he never saw anything. He said that at some point the sensation simply stopped, as though whatever had been there was no longer there. He paused in the interview before adding one final detail. He said that the following morning, another man from his squad, a man he had not spoken with overnight, described the same experience from a position on the other side of the crater, the same direction, the same duration. Neither man filed a report. There was a war to fight. Before proceeding, it is necessary to consider the landscape of conditions inside which all of these accounts exist. Combat soldiers operate under a sustained physiological burden that most people will never experience. Sleep deprivation is not an incidental feature of combat. It is structural to it. Watch rotations mean that even when a soldier is not on duty, he is sleeping in 2 and 4 hour segments, in environments that are frequently cold, wet, loud, and threatening. The research literature on military performance and sleep is consistent and unambiguous. After 72 hours of fragmented sleep, the most complex cognitive functions begin to degrade in ways that are not always apparent to the individual experiencing the degradation. Sensory processing becomes unreliable. Pattern recognition, the same pattern recognition that keeps a soldier alive by detecting movement, sound, and threat, begins to produce false positives. Isolation compounds this. A soldier on night watch in an observation post, separated from the main perimeter, experiencing what one Vietnam veteran's account described as a sense of being truly in no man's land and on his own until dawn. That soldier is operating with a threat detection system running at maximum sensitivity in an environment designed by darkness and terrain confounded. Stress, sustained over weeks and months rather than hours, alters the chemistry of perception. The hypervigilance that combats survival requires does not simply switch off during quiet periods. It persists. It finds threat even in the absence of threat, because the alternative, relaxing into vulnerability, is not an available option. These factors account for a very large proportion of what gets reported from battlefields at night. Military researchers and psychologists have documented this extensively. The hostile wilderness of the human mind under extreme duress is well-charted territory. These factors explain many reports. They do not explain all of them. What the existing framework struggle with is the specificity of the accounts, the directional precision, the temporal clustering, the physical responses that multiple men described in near-identical terms without having compared notes beforehand, and, perhaps most notably, the absence of escalation. A sleep-deprived mind that generates a threat perception tends to spiral, to catastrophize, to produce movement where there is none, to fire at shadows. The accounts from these units describe something different. They describe a sustained, calm, specific sensation that produced no escalation, no breakdown, and no action. The men who experienced it largely sat with it, endured it, and went back to their bunks when their watch ended. That restraint itself is unusual. The testimony of a soldier from the 25th Infantry Division, 27th Regiment, 2nd Battalion, stationed near Chorwan in the Iron Triangle sector during the spring of 1951, was collected in an interview conducted decades after the conflict. The soldier, who served as a private first class during the relevant period, agreed to give a detailed account of his experience on the condition that his account be understood as a sincere effort to describe what he actually observed, without embellishment and without interpretation. His unit had been in position on a hillside overlooking a small valley for approximately 2 weeks. They had experienced mortar fire. They had conducted patrols. They had made contact with enemy forces on 2 separate occasions, neither of which resulted in significant casualties on their side. By the time the incident he described took place, the men in his company were, by his account, tired but functional, not broken down, not hallucinatory, tired in the way that soldiers in a sustained defensive position become tired, a deep background exhaustion that they had mostly learned to operate inside of. He was on the second watch rotation of the night. His position was on the eastern edge of the company's perimeter, with a clear line of sight across a shallow ravine to a ridge that rose on the opposite side, perhaps 300 meters distant. The ridge was heavily wooded. There was no moon. The only light was the occasional distant glow of artillery. He said the first thing he noticed was the insects. There were, he said, always insects. He had learned to navigate by their sound, the constant background noise of what lived in that hillside. And at some point during his watch, he realized that the insect noise on the eastern side of perimeter, the side facing the opposite ridge, had diminished, not stopped entirely, just diminished, pulled back from that direction, the way sound will sometimes do when something large is in the space between the sources. He described scanning the ridge opposite for several minutes and seeing nothing, normal darkness, normal stillness, and then he became aware of the watching. He was clear in the interview that he had not seen anything move. He had not heard anything. The change was interior, a sudden and absolute certainty that he was being observed from a specific point on the upper slope of the opposite ridge. He estimated the point as being perhaps 50 meters below the ridge line, in a dense section of the tree cover. He sat with that certainty for a long time. A military psychiatrist reviewing this account noted, clinically, that the symptom profile described, the sudden onset, the fixed directional perception, the physical alertness without identifiable stimulus, is consistent with hypervigilance associated with combat stress exposure. This is accurate and should not be dismissed. The soldier was asked in the interview whether he considered that possibility at the time. He said yes. He said he considered it carefully, specifically because he had been warned by older soldiers to distrust his own senses at night. He said he was familiar with the concept of his mind playing tricks on him. He said he sat with that explanation for approximately 10 minutes and could not make it fit, because the point he was watching did not feel like the product of his anxiety. It felt, he said, like something that was completely calm. He said that the particular quality of the watching, its patience, its stillness, was unlike anything he associated with a human threat. An enemy soldier in that position would have done something, would have moved or fired, or withdrawn to report. This did not move. This did not make a sound. It held its position through the remaining 2 hours of his watch and was, as far as he could determine, still there when his replacement arrived. He described the moment of watch handover carefully. He said he told the man relieving him, without preamble, without drama, to watch the upper slope of the ridge opposite, slightly left the center. He said the man nodded and took the position. He said that when he came back on watch 4 hours later, the replacement told him quietly that he had watched that slope for the first hour before going quiet. He said he had felt it too. The account from the Iron Triangle is not isolated. What follows is not a collection of folklore or legend. These are accounts drawn from the oral history record, from veterans' testimony, and from the documentary literature of several separate conflicts. From the jungles near the demilitarized zone in Vietnam, 1967. A Marine from a reconnaissance unit stationed in the area west of Dong Ha described a night observation post experience during which he and his partner both independently identified what they described as a sustained, fixed point of observation from the tree line to the north of their position. Neither man saw movement. Neither man reported it through official channels. The Marine, interviewed for a veteran's oral history project in the 1990s, said that what struck him most, in retrospect, was the agreement between himself and his partner. Two men, watching from the same small position, arriving at the same specific location in the darkness outside their wire, without having conferred. From the Korean DMZ sector in the late 1960s, during the period of heightened tension that military historians have since designated the DMZ War, soldiers from the 2nd Infantry Division reported, informally, that certain positions along the southern boundary of the demilitarized zone produced night watch experiences of a specific character, a persistent, directional sensation of observation from the Korean side of the line, in conditions that were not consistent with active North Korean patrol activity. These accounts appear in the informal testimony of veterans who served in Korea during this period, in memoirs, and in oral history collections. From accounts recorded by Pacific War veterans, the description from Peleliu already cited. A further account from Okinawa describes a similar experience in almost exactly the same language, a specific direction, a sustained duration, a physical response without identifiable cause, and an absence of escalation or revelation. The similarities across these accounts are notable for their specificity. They are not describing the general terror of night in a combat zone, which is well documented and easily explained. They are describing a particular kind of experience with a particular set of characteristics: fixed direction, sustained duration, physical response, the certainty of observation without its confirmation, the same sounds noted in different accounts, the same pulling back of ambient noise, the same physical sensation described across decades and conflicts in language that converges. This convergence does not prove anything. It does not explain anything. But it is not nothing, either. There are several serious explanations for what these soldiers were experiencing, and they deserve to be presented with full respect for their weight. The first is sensory pareidolia under stress. The human brain is a pattern recognition engine, and it is tuned specifically to find faces, forms, and presences in ambiguous visual data. This is not a flaw. It is the reason the species survived. In low-light conditions with high ambient threat, a brain running at maximum threat detection sensitivity will find presences in darkness with remarkable reliability. The fact that multiple men at the same position experience the same perception could reflect shared environmental cues, the same patch of shadow, the same configuration of trees, producing the same visual interpretation in brains primed by the same conditions. This explanation accounts well for many of the accounts. It almost fits all of them. The difficulty is the cases where the two men at a watch position were not looking at the same patch of darkness simultaneously, where the first man identified the location and then confirmed it with the second, rather than both arriving at it independently in parallel. The second explanation is infrasound, low-frequency sound below the threshold of human hearing, generated by wind moving through terrain, by certain geological features, by atmospheric conditions, has been documented to produce sensations of unease, presence, and disorientation in human subjects. Certain kinds of terrain can function as natural resonators, and the physiological effects of infrasound exposure include the precise sensation of being watched, of something being present that cannot be identified. This is a well-researched phenomenon. The Korean ridgelines and the Vietnamese terrain both have characteristics that could, in principle, support infrasound generation under specific atmospheric conditions. This explanation is compelling. It accounts for the physical sensation, the absence of visual confirmation, and the timing. Pre-dawn atmospheric conditions are often associated with specific wind patterns that could activate such effects. What it does not account for as cleanly is the directionality. Infrasound-induced presence perception tends to be non-directional, ambient, surrounding. What the soldiers described was specific, pointed, located. The third explanation is mutual suggestion, that the first man to describe the sensation shaped the perceptions of those who followed. This is a legitimate concern in any testimonial record. Human beings are extraordinarily susceptible to social influence in ambiguous situations, particularly in high-stress group environments. And yet, the accounts from men who described the experience before comparing notes with their watch partners, the man in the iron triangle who identified the location before handing off the watch, the two Marines on Peleliu who had not spoken between their respective watches. These cases are harder to attribute to suggestion alone. Each explanation, examined carefully, accounts for part of what was reported. None of them, examined carefully, account for all of it. In the winter of 1968, a long-range reconnaissance patrol operated in the highland jungle west of Peleliu, in the Central Highlands of South Vietnam. The four-man team had inserted by helicopter into a landing zone cut into the canopy approximately 12 kilometers from their objective, a trail intersection that intelligence suggested was being used for night resupply movement along a branch of what American forces called the Ho Chi Minh Trail System. Their mission was to observe and report. They were not to engage. The team leader was an experienced soldier on his second tour. The other three men had varying levels of experience, but all had been in country for several months. They moved to their observation position without incident during the afternoon of the first day and established a hide site in a dense patch of vegetation on a low ridgeline with a view of the trail below. They settled in for what was anticipated to be a 3-night observation. The first night passed without event, or nearly so. The trail was quiet. There was occasional distant artillery. The team rotated through their watch schedule. In the debriefing conducted after the patrol's extraction, the team leader noted, almost as an aside, that during the second half of the first night, he had experienced a sustained and specific sense of observation from the northwest. He noted the direction, the approximate duration, and the fact that he had scanned the northwest quadrant thoroughly and found nothing. He attributed it, in the debrief, to fatigue. He moved on to the next item in his report. The second night, the trail showed activity. The team observed a column of figures moving south along the track below their position. They counted the movement, recorded it, and maintained silence. This was their mission. This is what they reported. It was also during the second night that the youngest member of the team passed a folded note to man beside him during a watch overlap, a practice they used when they needed to communicate without sound. The note, referenced in the post-patrol debrief, said simply, Northwest. Something has been there for an hour. The team leader, informed of this note the following morning, confirmed that he had experienced the same sensation in the same direction at roughly the same time during the previous night. He said nothing further in the debrief about this. He circled back to the trail count numbers. The debrief moved on. The third night, the trail was quiet again. The team maintained their position, preparing for extraction the following afternoon. The watch rotation proceeded normally. Somewhere in the period between 2 and 4 in the morning, all 4 members of the team were, at different points, awake. Each man, in succession, passed the same direction to whoever relieved him, not through a note, just a gesture, a nod, a hand raised, a point with 2 fingers. Northwest. When the team was extracted the following afternoon, all 4 men confirmed, independently and while conferring during the extraction helicopter ride, that they had spent a portion of the third night watching the northwest slope. None of them had seen anything. None of them had heard anything. The team leader, asked in a follow-up interview some years later what he made of it, was quiet for a long time before he answered. He said that in 2 tours of more than 40 patrols in that terrain, he had learned to trust the consensus of trained men. He said that 4 trained soldiers independently arriving at the same specific location in the darkness was not an accident. He said that whatever was out there had been very careful. He said it had never given them anything to confirm. He was asked whether he thought about it afterward. He said he thought about it for years. He said the thing that stayed with him was not what he might have seen, but what he felt. He described it as the sensation of being studied, not threatened, not followed, studied with a patience, he said, that was difficult to attribute to any living thing he had ever encountered in that jungle. He was not asked to clarify what he meant by that. He did not elaborate. There is a quality to the testimony of men who have served in combat at night that is difficult to replicate and impossible to dismiss. They are not, as a category, credulous men. They have learned to distrust their senses as a matter of survival. They have seen what fear does to perception. They know the difference, they will tell you, between what the mind manufactures and what the body reports independently. And yet the accounts persist. They persist across conflicts. They persist across decades. They persist across the geography of wars fought in jungles and on mountains and along frozen ridgelines, in a particular darkness that only exists where human light does not reach. The official record contains the coordinates and the body counts and the weather reports. It contains the patrol logs and the after-action summaries and the medical evacuation tallies. What it does not contain, what was never designed to contain, is what a man felt on the second hour of his watch when the insects went quiet and he became certain that something on the opposite ridge had been looking at him for a very long time. The closest thing to an explanation that the available research offers is that the human threat detection system, pushed beyond its design limits by conditions that no organism evolved to sustain, sometimes generates perceptions that cannot be sourced or verified. That the exhausted, hyper-vigilant mind of a combat soldier is capable of producing experiences so specific and so consistent that they become indistinguishable to the person having them from observation. This may be true. It is also true that these men, most of them, do not believe it. They believe something was out there. They believe it was watching them. They believe it was patient in a way that suggested it had no particular need to hurry. And they believe, the ones who have thought about it longest and most carefully, that whatever it was, it is still out there, that the jungle still knows about it, that the particular silence that preceded its arrival and followed its departure is not random and not generated by their own exhaustion, but is something the land itself has learned to make around a presence it recognized long before any of them arrived. They believe, many of them, that it watched them go as carefully as it watched them come, and that somewhere in a darkness that has never been fully mapped, it is watching still.